In the suffocating stillness of courtroom 4B, my husband Derek leaned back in his chair with that infuriating smirk plastered across his face, whispering loud enough for everyone to hear that I should be grateful he was only asking for half of everything, considering my pathetic minimum wage bookstore job barely kept the lights on. Judge Patricia Hendricks paused mid-sentence while reviewing our financial disclosures, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she looked from the documents to me, then to Derek, then back to the documents again before asking in a tone that made the court reporter sit up straighter. Mr. Brennan, are you aware that your wife's personal net worth is currently valued at $42 million? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like every divorce proceeding probably starts, with dread sitting heavy in my chest and the metallic taste of anxiety coating my tongue. I had arrived at the Boulder County Justice Center at 7:30, a full hour before our 9 o'clock hearing, because I needed time to prepare myself mentally for what was coming. The building itself was an imposing structure of glass and steel that reflected the early October sky. All gray clouds and the promise of rain that matched my mood perfectly. I sat in my car in the parking structure for 20 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel while I practiced the breathing exercises my therapist had taught me. In through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 7, out through the mouth for 8. The technique was supposed to calm the nervous system, to trick your body into believing everything was fine, even when your entire world was being dissected by lawyers and judges, and a man who had promised to love you forever, but had somehow forgotten what that word actually meant. My attorney, Margaret Chun, had texted me at 7:15 reminding me to arrive early, and to remember everything we had discussed during our preparation sessions. Margaret was in her late 50s, a woman whose reputation in family law preceded her like a force of nature. She had silver hair cut in a sharp bob that somehow made her look both elegant and intimidating, and she wore suits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. When I first met her 6 months ago, she had looked at me across her massive desk with its neat stacks of legal files, and asked me a single question that had changed everything. "Nina, do you want to win this case or do you want to be nice?" I had told her I wanted to win. The courthouse hallways smelled like floor polish and recycled air, that particular institutional scent that all government buildings seem to share regardless of how new or well-maintained they are. My heels clicked against the polished concrete floors as I made my way through security, removing my watch and earrings, placing my purse on the conveyor belt, walking through the metal detector that beeped once before the security officer waved me through with a bored nod. Margaret was already waiting outside courtroom 4B when I arrived, standing with the posture of someone who had spent decades commanding attention in legal proceedings. She wore a charcoal gray suit today with a cream-colored blouse, and her briefcase sat at her feet like a well-trained dog. When she saw me approaching, her expression softened slightly in what I had learned was her version of a reassuring smile. "You look composed," she said, which was her way of saying I looked terrified but was doing an adequate job of hiding it. "Remember what we discussed. Let me handle the talking. Your job is to sit quietly, maintain eye contact with the judge when appropriate, and do not react to anything Derek or his attorney says. No matter how outrageous, no matter how false, no matter how much it makes you want to scream. Can you do that?" I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I actually spoke. "Nina, I need to hear you say it." "I can do that," I managed, my voice coming out stronger than I felt inside. Margaret studied my face for another moment, then nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Judge Hendricks is fair but no nonsense. She does not appreciate games, she does not tolerate lying, and she has seen every manipulation tactic in the book. That works in our favor. Derek's attorney is going to try to paint you as a dependent spouse who contributed nothing financially to the marriage. We are going to let them make that argument in detail before we present our evidence." "Why would we let them do that?" I asked, confusion cutting through my anxiety. "Because the further out on a limb they climb, the more spectacular the fall when we saw it off," Margaret replied with the kind of smile that made me grateful she was on my side. "Trust me. I have been doing this for 32 years. This is going to be very satisfying." Derek arrived 15 minutes later with his attorney, Richard Gould, a man in his early 40s who wore expensive suits and cheap cologne, a combination that somehow perfectly encapsulated his approach to law. Gould had a reputation for aggressive tactics and dramatic courtroom presentations, The kind of lawyer who believed volume and confidence could substitute for actual legal merit. He was exactly the kind of representation Derek would choose, all flash and performance with minimal substance underneath. My husband looked different than he had when I last saw him 3 months ago at the mediation session that had ended with him storming out after refusing every reasonable settlement proposal Margaret had presented. He had gained weight, maybe 15 pounds, and his face had taken on a slightly puffy quality that suggested too much drinking and too little sleep. He wore a navy suit that I recognized as one I had bought him 2 Christmases ago, back when I still believed we could salvage something from the wreckage of our marriage. When Derek saw me sitting on the bench outside the courtroom, his expression shifted into something between contempt and smug satisfaction. He whispered something to Gould that made his attorney laugh, a performative sound meant to be overheard and to make me feel small. I kept my face neutral, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Derek's left shoulder. Margaret had been right when she said the most powerful response to antagonism was absolute composure. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors at exactly 8:55, and we filed in with the formality of a funeral procession. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected from watching legal dramas on television, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a slightly greenish tint. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front of the room, flanked by the American flag and the Colorado state flag. 2 tables faced the bench, one for each party and their legal representation, separated by an aisle that felt like a canyon. Margaret and I took our position at the plaintiff's table on the right side of the courtroom. She arranged her files with precise efficiency, each document tabbed and organized in a way that suggested she could locate any piece of information within seconds. I sat beside her, my hands folded on the table in front of me, trying to embody the composure she had coached me to maintain. Derek and Gould settled at the defense table, and I could hear them whispering to each other with barely suppressed excitement. Derek kept glancing over at me with that smirk, the one that had once been charming when directed at other people during social gatherings, but had become his default expression when looking at me over the past 2 years. It was the expression of someone who believed they had already won, and was simply waiting for everyone else to acknowledge their victory. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered at precisely 9 o'clock, and we all stood as the bailiff announced her arrival. She was a woman in her mid-60s with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of face that had probably been beautiful once but had settled into something more impressive than beauty, a landscape of experience and hard-won wisdom. She wore black robes that somehow made her seem even more formidable, and when she sat down and arranged her own files on the bench, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. "Please be seated," Judge Hendricks said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had presided over thousands of cases and had stopped being impressed by courtroom drama decades ago. "We are here today for the dissolution of marriage proceedings between Nina Marie Castellano and Derek James Brennan. I have reviewed the preliminary filings from both parties, and I must say this appears to be a relatively straightforward case of asset division and spousal support determination." Gould stood immediately, his movement theatrical and attention-seeking. "Your Honor, if I may, I believe you will find that this case, while it may appear straightforward on the surface, involves significant complexity regarding the respective contributions of each party to the marital estate and the appropriate allocation of assets moving forward." Judge Hendricks looked at him over her reading glasses with an expression that suggested she had heard similar opening statements countless times before and found them tedious. "Mr. Gould, I have been practicing family law since before you graduated from high school. Please sit down and wait for me to invite your presentation." A flush crept up Gould's neck, but he sat down with a forced smile, turning to whisper something to Derek that was probably meant to be reassuring but came across as defensive. Margaret remained perfectly still beside me, her expression neutral but her eyes alert. I could feel her attention tracking every movement in the courtroom, cataloging every word, every gesture, every small detail that might become relevant as the proceedings unfolded. This was her element, and watching her work was like watching a master craftsperson who had spent decades perfecting their art. Judge Hendricks continued, pulling up documents on her computer screen, while simultaneously reviewing the physical files in front of her. "According to the filings, Mr. Brennan is requesting spousal maintenance in the amount of $7,000 per month, 50% of all marital assets including the marital home located at 1247 Oakmont Drive, 50% of all retirement accounts and investments, and sole ownership of the 2023 Audi Q7 currently titled in Mrs. Castellano's name. Derek leaned forward slightly, his smirk growing wider. I could see his knee bouncing under the table with barely contained energy, the physical manifestation of his excitement at what he believed was coming. Mrs. Castellano is contesting these requests? Judge Hendricks asked, looking at Margaret. Yes, Your Honor, Margaret replied, standing with fluid grace. My client believes that Mr. Brennan's requests are not only unreasonable, but are based on a fundamental misrepresentation of the financial circumstances of this marriage and the respective contributions of each party. I see. Judge Hendricks made a note on her computer. Mr. Gould, would you like to present your client's position regarding these requests? Gould stood again, this time with more caution after his earlier rebuke, but his confidence quickly reasserted itself as he launched into what was clearly a prepared speech. Your Honor, my client Derek Brennan entered into marriage with Mrs. Castellano 7 years ago, with the understanding that they would be building a life together as equal partners. However, over the course of their marriage, a troubling pattern emerged whereby Mrs. Castellano became increasingly focused on her personal interests while my client shouldered the burden of maintaining their household and supporting her various pursuits. I felt my jaw tighten but kept my expression neutral. Margaret had warned me that Gould would try to rewrite the history of our marriage, and she had been absolutely right. Mr. Brennan worked tirelessly in his position as a regional sales manager for Horizon Technologies, Gould continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a dramatic monologue. He brought home a substantial salary that funded their lifestyle, paid the mortgage on their home, covered all household expenses, and allowed Mrs. Castellano the luxury of pursuing her hobbies without the pressure of contributing financially to their partnership. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hobbies. He had called my work hobbies. While Mr. Brennan was building his career and providing for their family, Gould said, pacing now in what he probably thought was compelling courtroom theater, Mrs. Castellano spent her days working part-time at a small bookstore, earning minimum wage, contributing virtually nothing to their household income. My client supported this arrangement out of love and a genuine desire to see his wife happy, even though it placed an unfair financial burden entirely on his shoulders. Derek nodded along with his attorney's words, his expression shifting into something that was supposed to look like noble suffering but came across more like poorly acted martyrdom. Judge Hendricks made another note, her expression unreadable. And what is your contention regarding asset division? Your Honor, given that Mr. Brennan was the primary breadwinner throughout the marriage, and that Mrs. Castellano contributed minimally to their financial well-being, my client believes he is entitled to the majority of marital assets. However, in the spirit of fairness and recognizing his former affection for Mrs. Castellano, he is willing to accept a 50-50 split of assets, provided he receives appropriate spousal support to maintain the standard of living he established during the marriage. The audacity of this statement hung in the air like smoke. Derek had somehow convinced himself, or had been convinced by his attorney, that he was being generous by only demanding half of everything while also requiring me to pay him $7,000 per month for the privilege of escaping a marriage that had become suffocating. Margaret remained seated throughout Gould's entire presentation, occasionally making notes on her legal pad but otherwise appearing completely unimpressed by the performance. When Gould finally sat down, looking pleased with himself, Margaret stood slowly, taking her time in a way that commanded attention without demanding it. Your Honor, Margaret began, her voice calm and professional, Mr. Gould has presented a version of events that is, to put it charitably, incomplete. My client is prepared to demonstrate that the actual financial circumstances of this marriage are quite different from what opposing counsel has suggested. I look forward to hearing your client's position, Judge Hendricks said, and I caught something in her tone that suggested she had already begun to suspect there was more to this case than Gould's theatrical presentation had indicated. Margaret opened the first file in front of her, removing a document that she approached the bench to hand to Judge Hendricks while simultaneously providing a copy to Gould. Your Honor, this is a complete financial disclosure from my client, prepared by the accounting firm of Morrison & Associates, detailing all assets, income streams, investments and business interests currently held by Mrs. Castellano. I watched as Judge Hendricks began reading the document, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly as she progressed down the first page. Gould was also reading his copy, but his expression showed only confusion at first, as if he could not quite process what he was seeing. According to this disclosure, Margaret continued, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet courtroom, Mrs. Castellano's current personal net worth is valued at approximately $42 million, comprised of various investments, business holdings, real estate assets, and intellectual property rights. This wealth was accumulated entirely through my client's efforts, beginning before her marriage to Mr. Brennan and continuing throughout their marriage, with no financial contribution from Mr. Brennan whatsoever. The silence that followed this statement was absolute. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking, could hear someone's stomach gurgling in the gallery behind us, could hear the bailiff shift his weight from one foot to the other. Derek had gone completely still, his smirk frozen on his face like a mask that he had forgotten how to remove. Judge Hendricks looked up from the documents, removing her reading glasses and fixing Derek with a stare that could have stripped paint. Mr. Brennan, are you aware that your wife's personal net worth is currently valued at $42 million? Derek opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping on a dock, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been the first stirrings of panic. What? That's not. She works at a bookstore, Derek finally managed, his voice coming out strangled and wrong. She owns the bookstore, Mr. Brennan, Judge Hendricks replied, looking back down at the documents. According to this disclosure, she owns 12 bookstores across 3 states, which collectively generate approximately $8.3 million in annual revenue. Is this your understanding of your wife's employment? The smirk was completely gone now, replaced by an expression of utter bewilderment. Derek turned to look at Gould, who was still staring at the financial disclosure as if it were written in a language he could not quite translate. Your Honor, Gould said, his earlier theatrical confidence completely evaporated. I was not made aware of these assets during discovery. If Mrs. Castellano has been concealing financial information, Mr. Gould, Judge Hendricks interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, before you continue down that particular path, I suggest you review the discovery documents provided by opposing counsel. According to the filing timestamps here, Mrs. Castellano's legal team provided comprehensive financial disclosure 6 weeks ago. Did you not review these materials? Gould's face had gone pale. He shuffled through files on his table with increasing desperation, finally pulling out a thick envelope that looked unopened. His hands shook slightly as he tore it open, pulling out documents that were clearly the same financial disclosures Margaret had just presented to the court. We received these, Your Honor, but I had not yet had the opportunity to review them in detail, Gould admitted, and I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. You filed for a hearing regarding asset division and spousal support, without reviewing the opposing party's financial disclosure? Judge Hendricks asked, and her tone had moved beyond sharp into something that sounded genuinely incredulous. Mr. Gould, in my courtroom, we do not waste judicial resources because attorneys cannot be bothered to review discovery materials. I am inclined to sanction you for this level of incompetence, but I will reserve judgment on that matter until we complete today's proceedings. Derek was still staring at me from across the aisle, and I met his gaze steadily for the first time since entering the courtroom. His expression had transformed completely from smugness to something approaching horror, as the reality of his situation began penetrating his carefully constructed delusions. Margaret remained standing, waiting patiently for the shock to settle before continuing. Your Honor, if I may proceed with additional context regarding the specific assets and their acquisition? Please do, Ms. Chun, Judge Hendricks replied, leaning back in her chair with an expression that suggested she was now fully engaged in what had transformed from a routine hearing into something considerably more interesting. Margaret pulled out another document, this one bound in a blue cover that I recognized as the comprehensive asset report we had spent weeks preparing. Mrs. Castellano began her business ventures at age 23, 2 years before meeting Mr. Brennan. Using an inheritance from her grandmother of $150,000, she purchased a failing bookstore in Boulder and transformed it into a profitable enterprise within 18 months. Over the following 9 years, She expanded this single location into the chain of 12 stores currently operating under the name Castellano Literary Collective. I watched Derek's face as Margaret spoke, watching him process information about my life that he had apparently never bothered to learn despite living with me for 7 years. It would have been satisfying if it were not also profoundly sad that the man I had married had paid so little attention to who I actually was or what I actually did with my time. In addition to the bookstore holdings, Margaret continued, Mrs. Castellano has invested in commercial real estate, including 4 properties in Boulder, 2 in Denver and 3 in Fort Collins. She also holds intellectual property rights to a series of literary analysis guides she developed, which are used in educational institutions across the country and generate approximately $2 million annually in licensing fees. Judge Hendricks was taking notes now, occasionally glancing at Derek with an expression that I could not quite read but that made him sink lower in his chair with each passing moment. Throughout her marriage to Mr. Brennan, Margaret said, her voice taking on a harder edge, Mrs. Castellano maintained completely separate finances for all of her business ventures. Mr. Brennan had no involvement in any business decisions, contributed no capital to any expansions or investments, and provided no labor or expertise to any of her enterprises. The only financial interaction between them was Mrs. Castellano's payment of all household expenses from a separate checking account she maintained specifically for that purpose. And Mr. Brennan's income during the marriage? Judge Hendricks asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Mr. Brennan was employed as a regional sales manager for Horizon Technologies for the first 3 years of their marriage, earning approximately $68,000 annually, Margaret replied. He was terminated from that position 4 years ago, due to performance issues documented by his employer. Since that time he has held sporadic employment in various sales positions, with his longest tenure at any single company being 7 months. His current income is approximately $22,000 annually, working part-time at a sporting goods retail store. The silence that followed this revelation was somehow even more profound than the previous one. I had known, of course, about Derek's employment struggles, about the jobs he had lost or quit, about the periods of unemployment that stretched for months while he claimed to be pursuing better opportunities that never materialized. What I had not known until Margaret's investigation revealed it was that he had been lying to me about his income, claiming earnings that were double or triple his actual salary while spending money I transferred to our joint account for household expenses. Let me make certain I understand the situation correctly, Judge Hendricks said, removing her glasses again and polishing them with a cloth she pulled from her desk drawer. Mr. Brennan, who currently earns approximately $22,000 per year working part-time retail, is requesting $7,000 per month in spousal support from a wife worth $42 million, whose primary sin appears to be that she did not inform him about the full extent of her wealth. Derek's attorney started to respond, but Judge Hendricks held up one hand to silence him. I am not finished. Mr. Brennan, during your marriage, were you under the impression that your wife worked for minimum wage at a bookstore? Derek nodded mutely, apparently unable to trust his voice. Did you ever ask her about her work? About how the bookstore was performing? About her business plans or financial situation? Derek shook his head. Did you contribute financially to household expenses? Another head shake, this one smaller, as if he were hoping to make himself invisible through stillness. Judge Hendricks set her glasses down on the bench and looked at Derek with an expression that combined disappointment and something that might have been pity. Mr. Brennan, I have been presiding over family court for 17 years. In that time I have seen every variation of financial manipulation, deception and exploitation that human beings can devise in the context of marriage and divorce. What I am seeing today is not manipulation on the part of your wife. What I am seeing is a successful businesswoman who supported a husband that contributed nothing financially to their marriage, while he apparently never bothered to notice or care what she actually did for a living. Margaret sat down beside me, and I felt her hand briefly touch my arm in a gesture of solidarity that I had not known I needed until that moment. Across the aisle, Gould and Derek were having a whispered conversation that looked increasingly desperate, and I knew that every assumption they had made about this case, every strategy they had planned, every argument they had prepared was currently crumbling into dust. The morning that had begun with Derek's smirk and my anxiety had transformed into something I had not quite anticipated. Not victory exactly, because the proceedings were far from over, and there would be more hearings, more arguments, more opportunities for Derek to make this process difficult. But what I felt in that moment, watching the realization dawn on my husband's face that he had fundamentally misunderstood who he had been married to, was something close to vindication. Judge Hendricks was reviewing more documents now, occasionally asking Margaret clarifying questions about specific assets or income streams. The courtroom had taken on a different energy, the earlier theatricality replaced by something more substantial and serious. This was no longer a simple divorce proceeding. This had become a case study in financial independence, in the price of inattention, in what happens when someone mistakes quietness for weakness and privacy for poverty. I thought about all the times over the past 7 years when Derek had made comments about my bookstore job, little dismissive remarks about how nice it must be to have a hobby that brought in a little spending money. I thought about the times he had suggested I should focus more on our home life instead of wasting so much time at work. I thought about the contempt in his voice when he told his friends at parties that I was just a bookstore clerk while he was in sales, as if there were some hierarchy of value in those positions that put him above me. What Derek had never bothered to learn was that I went to work at 6 in the morning, and often did not leave until 8 at night. That the papers I brought home were not leisure reading but financial reports, expansion proposals, market analyses, and contract negotiations. That the phone calls I took during dinner were not social conversations but business dealings with suppliers, real estate agents, lawyers, and investors. He had seen what he wanted to see, had created a version of me in his mind that justified his own lack of ambition and contribution, and had never questioned whether that version bore any resemblance to reality. Judge Hendricks finally looked up from her documents and fixed both Derek and his attorney with a stare that made them both straighten unconsciously in their chairs. "Gentlemen, I am going to give you an opportunity that your preparation for this hearing did not earn. We are going to take a 30-minute recess, during which time I strongly suggest you review the financial disclosures you should have examined 6 weeks ago, and reconsider the requests you have made in this proceeding. When we reconvene, I will hear your revised position regarding asset division and spousal support. I will tell you now that I am not favorably inclined toward Mr. Brennan's current requests, given what has been revealed about the actual circumstances of this marriage." She stood, and we all stood with her as she exited the courtroom through the door behind the bench. The moment the door closed, the courtroom erupted into hushed conversations. Gould immediately began flipping through the financial disclosure documents with the frantic energy of a student who had just discovered an exam was comprehensive, when he had only studied the first chapter. Derek sat frozen, staring at nothing, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists on the table in front of him. Margaret gathered her files with calm efficiency, then turned to me with an expression that was as close to satisfaction as I had ever seen on her professionally neutral face. "That went well," she said simply. I laughed, a sound that came out slightly strangled because I was not entirely certain whether I wanted to laugh or cry, or possibly both simultaneously. "That was your plan? Let them humiliate themselves before revealing everything?" "Every time," Margaret replied, picking up her briefcase. "People reveal their true nature when they think they are winning." Derek showed the judge exactly who he is. Now she has context for every decision she makes going forward. "Come on, let us get some air before round 2 begins." We walked out of the courtroom into the hallway, where other people waited for their own hearings, their own life-changing moments in rooms that smelled like floor polish and broken promises. I stood by the windows looking out at the parking structure where I had sat in my car just 2 hours earlier, practicing breathing exercises and trying to prepare myself for whatever was coming. What had come was not what I expected. It was better. It was honest. It was the truth finally spoken aloud in a room where truth mattered and could not be dismissed with a smirk or explained away with a convenient lie. Margaret checked her phone, responding to a few messages while we waited for the recess to end. "He is going to try to negotiate," she said without looking up from her screen. "Gould is probably giving him the worst news of his life right now, explaining that not only is he not getting anything, but he may end up owing you money if the judge decides he needs to reimburse you for his share of household expenses over the past 7 years. Will she do that?" I asked, not certain whether I wanted the answer to be yes or no. "Probably not," Margaret admitted, finally looking up. "Judges generally prefer clean breaks in divorce proceedings. But the fact that it is possible will motivate Derek to accept whatever settlement we offer rather than continuing this fight. Nobody wants to be the cautionary tale that other divorce attorneys tell their clients about what happens when you get greedy and stupid simultaneously. Through the courtroom windows, I could see Derek and Gould in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Derek's face had progressed from pale to red, and his gestures had become increasingly animated. Gould kept trying to calm him down, placing a hand on his shoulder that Derek immediately shook off. Whatever fantasy Derek had constructed about this divorce was being systematically demolished by reality, and he was not handling the demolition well. When we returned to the courtroom 28 minutes later, Derek looked like he had aged 5 years in half an hour. His earlier confidence had been completely replaced by something that resembled shell shock. He would not meet my eyes as we took our positions at our respective tables, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he tried to arrange papers that did not need arranging. Judge Hendricks returned precisely at the scheduled time, and we rose again as she entered and settled herself at the bench. She opened a file, reviewed something briefly, then looked directly at Gould. "Mr. Gould, has your client reconsidered his position?" Gould stood slowly, and for the first time since I had met him, he looked genuinely chastened rather than performing chastened for effect. "Yes, Your Honor. After reviewing the financial disclosures and discussing the matter with my client, Mr. Brennan would like to withdraw his requests for spousal support and for division of assets beyond those items that he personally brought into the marriage or purchased with his own income." "I see," Judge Hendricks said neutrally. "And Mrs. Castellano's position?" Margaret stood beside me. "Your Honor, my client is agreeable to Mr. Brennan retaining any personal property he brought into the marriage or purchased with documented personal funds. She requests that Mr. Brennan vacate the marital home within 30 days, and that he return the Audi Q7, which was purchased entirely with my client's funds and remains titled in her name. Beyond that, my client seeks only the dissolution of the marriage with no further financial obligations to Mr. Brennan." Judge Hendricks nodded slowly, making notes. "Mr. Brennan, do you understand that you are agreeing to leave this marriage with essentially nothing beyond your personal effects?" Derek stood, his voice barely audible when he spoke. "Yes, Your Honor. And you understand that you are waiving any claims to your wife's substantial assets, properties, and business interests?" "Yes, Your Honor." The judge studied him for a long moment, and I wondered what she saw. A man who had made catastrophic assumptions and was now paying the price. A husband who had never bothered to know his wife. A person forced to confront the consequences of years of inattention and entitlement. "Very well," Judge Hendricks finally said. "I am granting the dissolution of marriage between Nina Marie Castellano and Derek James Brennan. Mrs. Castellano shall retain all properties, business interests, and assets documented in the financial disclosure. Mr. Brennan shall vacate the marital residence within 30 days, and shall return the vehicle currently in his possession. Neither party shall have financial obligations to the other beyond Mr. Brennan's responsibility to remove his personal property from the marital home. This divorce is final effective immediately upon the filing of the dissolution decree." She signed several documents, handed them to the court clerk, then looked at both parties one final time. "I wish you both better fortune in your future endeavors. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a sound like punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. Around us, people began gathering their belongings and filing out of the courtroom. Margaret was already packing her files, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Across the aisle, Derek remained seated, staring at the table in front of him while Gould spoke to him in low, urgent tones. I stood slowly, my legs feeling strangely unsteady despite the fact that everything had gone better than I could have reasonably hoped. 7 years of marriage, dissolved in less than 3 hours. A relationship that had consumed so much of my energy and emotion, reduced to legal documents and judicial rulings. As we walked toward the exit, Derek finally looked up and our eyes met across the courtroom. I tried to read his expression to understand what he was thinking in that moment, but his face was blank, shuttered, closed off completely. The man I had loved or thought I had loved, or had tried to love despite everything, was a stranger who had always been a stranger. I had just been too busy building my life to notice how little he had actually been part of it. Margaret held the door for me as we stepped into the hallway, and I felt something shift in my chest, some weight I had been carrying for years suddenly lighter. The divorce was over. The performance was finished. The truth had been spoken and recorded and filed away in legal documents that could not be rewritten or reinterpreted, based on convenient fictions. I was free. The realization hit me as we walked toward the elevator, and I had to stop for a moment, had to let it sink in completely. Free from Derek's assumptions and dismissals. Free from pretending his lies were merely misunderstandings. Free from the exhausting work of being married to someone who had never actually seen me. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked, her hand on my elbow, her professional demeanor softening into something approaching genuine concern. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. "I am absolutely all right." We walked out of the courthouse together into the October morning where the threatened rain had not materialized and the sun was breaking through the gray clouds in shafts of golden light that made the wet pavement shimmer. My car was waiting in the parking structure where I had left it hours ago, and as I clicked the key fob to unlock it, I thought about how the woman who had sat there practicing breathing exercises was already becoming someone else, someone lighter, someone unburdened by the weight of a marriage that had never been the partnership I had believed it to be. The drive back to my office took 20 minutes through familiar streets that somehow looked different in the aftermath of the hearing. I passed the original bookstore, the one I had purchased at 23 with my grandmother's inheritance, the foundation upon which everything else had been built. It looked exactly as it always had, the green awning slightly faded, the window display featuring new releases arranged with careful attention, but I saw it differently now, as if the morning's events had shifted my perspective on everything I had built. When I finally reached my private office on the third floor of the building I owned, I closed the door, walked to the window overlooking boulders downtown, and allowed myself a moment to simply breathe. Not the controlled breathing exercises meant to manage anxiety, but just breathing, existing, being present in a moment that marked an ending and a beginning simultaneously. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Claire, who had been waiting anxiously for news. She had sent a single word. "Well," I typed back. "It's over. I won. Actually, I didn't have to win anything. I just had to tell the truth." 3 dots appeared immediately as she typed her response. "I'm coming over tonight with wine and celebration. You deserve this." The celebration that evening with my sister Claire happened exactly as promised, though the wine remained mostly untouched because what I needed more than alcohol was simply the presence of someone who had witnessed the entire journey and understood what this ending actually meant. Claire arrived at my house at 7:30 carrying not just wine but also Thai food from the restaurant we had been going to since college, the one that knew exactly how much spice we could handle and never questioned our standing order of spring rolls and pad CW. We sat in my living room, the same room where Derek had spent countless hours playing video games and half watching television while I worked at my laptop, and the space felt different now, lighter somehow, as if his absence had created room for air to circulate properly for the first time in years. Claire kicked off her shoes and curled up on the couch with the easy familiarity of someone who had been coming to this house since before Derek had ever set foot in it. "Tell me everything," she said, opening the containers of food and arranging them on the coffee table with casual efficiency. "Start from the moment you walked into that courtroom, and do not leave out a single detail of his face when the judge read your net worth." I walked her through the entire morning, from my anxiety in the parking structure to Margaret's strategic silence while Gould made his theatrical presentation, from the moment of revelation to Derek's complete psychological collapse in the span of 30 minutes. Claire listened with the attention of someone who had earned the right to this story through years of supporting me through a marriage that had slowly revealed itself to be built on fundamental misunderstandings and willful ignorance. $42 million, Claire said when I finished, shaking her head with a mixture of amazement and vindication. "He lived with you for 7 years and never once asked about your actual financial situation. Never wondered how you paid for everything. Never questioned where the money came from." "He assumed it came from him," I replied, picking at my food without much appetite despite having eaten nothing since a piece of toast at 6 that morning. "He created this entire narrative where he was the provider and I was the dependent spouse with my cute little minimum wage bookstore job. It never occurred to him to verify whether that narrative had any basis in reality." Claire set down her fork and looked at me with an expression I recognized from our childhood, the one she wore when she was about to say something important and wanted to make certain I was actually listening. "Nina, I need to ask you something, And I need you to answer honestly. Why did you never tell him? Why did you let him believe you were earning minimum wage when you were actually running a multi-million-dollar enterprise? The question hung between us, and I realized it was the same question I had been asking myself since the moment Judge Hendricks read my net worth aloud in that courtroom. Why had I maintained the fiction? Why had I allowed Derek to continue operating under assumptions that were so fundamentally wrong about who I was and what I did? I think I wanted to know if he would love me anyway, I said slowly, the words forming themselves as I spoke them, giving shape to thoughts I had not quite articulated even to myself. When we first met, I was already successful, but I downplayed it because men often responded badly to women who earned more than them. Derek seemed different. He seemed confident enough in himself that my success would not threaten him, so I just never corrected his assumptions about my bookstore work. But he was threatened, Claire said gently. He just expressed it through dismissiveness instead of obvious insecurity. Every little comment about your hobby job, every suggestion that you should focus more on home life, every time he introduced you as just a bookstore clerk to his friends, that was his way of cutting you down to a size he could handle. I nodded, recognizing the truth in her words even though they stung with the accuracy of diagnosis. Derek had needed me to be smaller than I actually was because my real size made him feel inadequate. Rather than rising to meet me, he had spent years trying to convince both of us that I was already at his level, that we were equals in a partnership where he provided and I contributed my charming but ultimately insignificant little business on the side. The worst part, I admitted, is that I let him. I participated in the fiction. I could have insisted he understand my actual work and financial situation, but I chose not to because some part of me wanted to believe that if he loved the version of me he thought existed, then maybe the love was real even if his understanding was not. Claire reached across the coffee table and took my hand, squeezing it with the fierce protectiveness that had characterized our relationship since we were children. You were trying to be loved for who you are rather than what you have. That is not a character flaw, Nina. That is you being human and wanting what everyone wants. Derek's failure to actually see you or care enough to look beyond his assumptions is his failure, not yours. We sat in silence for a moment, the food growing cold between us while I processed the emotional archaeology of a marriage that had been built on sand and had finally washed away when the tide came in. Outside, the October darkness had settled completely, and through the windows I could see the lights of Boulder spreading out below my hillside home. Thousands of lives being lived in houses where people presumably knew each other better than Derek had ever known me. My phone buzzed on the table, and I glanced at the screen to see a text from an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I opened it and immediately recognized Derek's writing style even though he was texting from a number I did not have saved. We need to talk about what happened today. I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding, and we should discuss this privately before any final decisions are made. I still care about you and I think we can work through this if we just communicate openly. I showed the text to Claire, who read it and then made a sound that was half laugh and half snort of disbelief. The audacity of this man. He just got destroyed in court, learned that his wife is worth $42 million, and his response is to suggest there has been a misunderstanding. As if the financial records Margaret presented were somehow open to interpretation. He wants to renegotiate now that he understands what is actually at stake, I said, setting the phone back down without responding. Now that he knows what I am really worth, suddenly he wants to communicate openly. Where was this desire for open communication during the 7 years we were married? Exactly, Claire agreed. This is not about wanting to save the marriage or work things out. This is about him realizing he walked away from a fortune because he was too arrogant and self-absorbed to pay attention to what was actually happening in his own house. The text was followed by another one 10 minutes later, and then another 5 minutes after that. Each message grew progressively more desperate, moving from suggestions that we talk to assertions that he deserved another chance to barely veiled implications that I had somehow deceived him by not making my financial situation explicitly clear. I watched the messages arrive with a detached fascination, seeing in real time how Derek's mind was processing the day's revelations and attempting to construct a narrative where he was the victim rather than the architect of his own disaster. You should block the number, Claire suggested, but I shook my head. I want to see what he says. I want to understand how he is going to try to rewrite this story in his own mind. Margaret told me that people reveal their true nature when they think they are winning, but I think they also reveal it when they realize they have lost. By 10 o'clock, Derek had sent 12 messages ranging from conciliatory to accusatory to pathetically pleading. The progression was almost clinical in its demonstration of someone cycling through different manipulation tactics to see which one might generate a response. When none of them worked, when I maintained my silence and refused to engage, the final message arrived with a bitterness that was almost palpable through the screen. You think you are so smart with your business and your money, but you are going to end up alone because no real man wants a woman who has to hide what she is to feel normal. You will never find anyone who loves you for you because you don't even know who you actually are. Claire read this last message over my shoulder, and her response was immediate and fierce. Block him. Right now. That is not someone trying to communicate. That is someone trying to hurt you because he cannot accept responsibility for his own choices. She was right, of course, but something about that final message had struck a nerve that Derek probably had not even intended to hit. The accusation that I had hidden who I was, that I did not know my own identity, that I would end up alone because I had money and success rather than in spite of having neither. Those words carried a sting because somewhere deep down, in the part of myself that I tried not to examine too closely, I wondered if there was a grain of truth buried in the spite. Do you think he is right? I asked Claire quietly. Not about the manipulation or the blame, but about the hiding. Do you think I have been hiding who I am? Claire was quiet for a long moment, and I appreciated that she was actually considering the question rather than immediately offering reassurance that would feel hollow because it was unearned. I think you have been protecting yourself, she finally said. There is a difference between hiding and protecting. Hiding means you are ashamed of something and do not want others to see it. Protecting means you understand that not everyone can be trusted with your full truth, and you are careful about who gets access to all of you. But where is the line? I pressed. At what point does protection become dishonesty? I let Derek believe something about me that was fundamentally untrue for 7 years. Is that protection or deception? Did you ever lie to him directly about your work or your finances? No. Did he ever ask you specific questions about your income or your business operations? Not once. He never asked, and I never volunteered the information. Then you did not deceive him, Claire said firmly. You simply did not correct his assumptions. Derek made those assumptions based on his own prejudices and laziness. He saw a woman who worked at a bookstore and decided that meant she earned minimum wage and contributed nothing significant financially. He never investigated, never questioned, never showed enough interest in your actual life to learn what you really did all day. That failure belongs entirely to him. I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that I bore no responsibility for Derek's ignorance, but the doubt lingered like smoke that refused to fully dissipate. I had known what he believed and I had chosen not to correct him. I had made that choice deliberately, had maintained that fiction intentionally, and regardless of Derek's failures to inquire or investigate, I had been complicit in the misunderstanding that had defined our marriage. I think I need to understand why I did it, I said to Claire. Not why Derek failed to see me, but why I chose to remain invisible. Because that was a choice I made, and I need to understand what motivated it. Claire nodded slowly, recognizing that this was not a question she could answer for me, but one I needed to work through myself. Maybe that is the real work ahead, she suggested. Not dealing with Derek or the divorce or any of the practical matters. Maybe the real work is figuring out why you felt like you needed to be smaller than you are. After Claire left around midnight, I sat alone in my living room with the remains of our Thai food dinner, and the silence that had seemed so liberating that afternoon but now felt somehow heavy with unanswered questions. I pulled out my laptop and opened the file where I kept a journal, something I had started in college and had maintained sporadically over the years whenever I needed to process thoughts that felt too complex or too personal to share even with people I trusted. I wrote about the courtroom and Derek's face and the moment when Judge Hendricks read my net worth aloud. I wrote about the texts he had sent and the doubt they had raised, about Claire's reassurance and my inability to fully accept it. I wrote about the question that had been forming in my mind all evening, the one I had not quite been able to articulate until the words appeared on the screen in front of me. Who am I when I am not protecting myself from being seen? The question sat there on the page, stark and uncomfortable, demanding an answer I did not have. I had built an empire of bookstores and real estate and intellectual property. I had created wealth that exceeded most people's wildest dreams. I had negotiated contracts and managed employees, and made decisions that affected hundreds of lives. But somehow in all of that building and creating and achieving, I had never quite figured out how to exist as that person in intimate relationships. I had learned to be Nina Castellano the businesswoman, but I had never integrated that identity with Nina the wife or Nina the sister or Nina the friend or Nina the woman who simply wanted to be loved for who she actually was. The divorce had freed me from Derek, but it had also exposed this fundamental fracture in my own identity, this gap between the public version of myself and the private one, and I was beginning to recognize that healing that fracture would require work that was far more difficult than any courtroom proceeding. I closed my laptop and walked upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with Derek for 7 years but which had become mine alone 3 months ago when he moved out after our separation. The room was exactly as I had redecorated it after he left, with new bedding in colors he would have hated, with photographs on the walls of my business milestones and family gatherings, with books stacked on both nightstands instead of just mine. This was my space now, reclaimed and rearranged, but it still carried the echo of the years when I had compromised my preferences to accommodate someone who had never bothered to learn what those preferences actually were. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay awake thinking about the trajectory that had brought me to this moment, trying to trace back through the years to identify the exact point where I had made the decision to hide my success. It had not been a single moment but rather a series of small choices, each one reinforcing the previous one until the pattern had become so established that breaking it felt impossible. I remembered the early days with Derek when we first started dating and he had been impressed by my single bookstore, had thought it was charming and entrepreneurial and exactly the right size of ambitious for a woman he wanted to be with. I remembered how his enthusiasm had dimmed slightly when I mentioned wanting to expand, how he had suggested that maybe one store was enough, that maybe I should focus on making that one location perfect rather than spreading myself too thin with multiple ventures. I remembered not arguing with him, not insisting on my vision, but simply proceeding with my expansion plans without discussing them in detail. He had assumed I was working harder at the single location when actually I was in the process of acquiring my second store. By the time that purchase was complete and the new location was open, Derek had stopped asking about my work entirely, satisfied with his understanding that I had a small business that kept me occupied but was not particularly significant or demanding. That had been the pattern that established itself over the years. Derek would make assumptions based on limited information and his own biases. I would not correct those assumptions because doing so felt like inviting conflict or judgment or the kind of uncomfortable conversations that might reveal how fundamentally different our values and priorities actually were, and the gap between his perception and my reality would widen until it became a chasm that could not be crossed without demolishing everything built on false foundations. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through windows I had forgotten to cover with curtains the night before. I woke feeling unrest and slightly disoriented. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from hours of mental and emotional processing that continues even during sleep. My phone showed 3 new messages from Derek's number, all sent in the early hours of the morning and all variations on the same theme of demanding conversation and second chances and accusations of unfairness. I blocked the number before reading them in detail, finally taking Claire's advice even though it felt like closing a door that should have been closed months or even years ago. The blocking was anticlimactic, just a few taps on my phone screen, but it represented something larger, a boundary established, a line drawn, a statement that I was no longer available for Derek's attempts to rewrite history or renegotiate terms that had already been finalized by a court of law. My first meeting of the day was not until 10, which gave me time to shower and dress and attempt to reconstruct some version of professional composure despite feeling emotionally raw from the previous day's revelations. I stood in front of my closet, the one I had expanded after Derek left because suddenly I had room for all the clothes I had been storing in the guest room, and I selected a navy suit that Margaret would have approved of, armor disguised as business attire. The drive to my main office took 25 minutes through morning traffic that was heavier than usual due to construction on Highway 36. I used the time to call my business manager, Michael Torres, who had been with me since the expansion to my third location, and who knew more about my financial situation than anyone except my accountant and my attorney. Michael was in his early 40s, a former Wall Street analyst who had burned out on the corporate grind and had moved to Colorado seeking a better quality of life and work that felt more meaningful than optimizing shareholder value for companies he did not care about. "I heard about the hearing," Michael said when he answered, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Margaret's paralegal is friends with someone in my book club, and the story has already made the rounds in legal circles. Apparently you made quite an impression." "Derek made the impression," I corrected. "I just existed while his assumptions collapsed around him." From what I heard, his attorney did not even review the financial disclosures before filing for the hearing. That is staggering incompetence even by the low standards of divorce litigation. Richard Gould is apparently more interested in dramatic courtroom presentations than in actual preparation. I agreed. It worked out in our favor, but I keep thinking about what Margaret said, about how people reveal their true nature when they think they are winning. Derek revealed something yesterday that I am still trying to process. What did he reveal? That he never saw me. That he spent 7 years married to someone he never bothered to actually know. And that I let him do it because some part of me thought that made the relationship safer. Michael was quiet for a moment, and I appreciated that he understood when silence was more appropriate than immediate response. "Are you okay?" he finally asked, and the genuine concern in his voice made something catch in my chest. "I do not know yet," I admitted. "I thought the divorce would feel like an ending, like closing a chapter and moving on. But instead it feels like the beginning of questions I have been avoiding for a very long time." "Questions about what?" "About why I built all of this." I gestured at nothing since he could not see me, indicating the businesses and wealth and success that had defined my adult life, but never learned how to let anyone actually see what I had built. About why I was more comfortable being underestimated than being fully known. "Those are good questions," Michael said. "Hard ones but good ones. And you have time now to explore them without Derek's assumptions cluttering your thinking." We talked for a few more minutes about the upcoming expansion plans for a new location in Fort Collins, and the negotiations with a commercial real estate developer, who wanted to include one of my stores as an anchor tenant in a mixed-use development they were planning. The work was familiar and grounding, pulling me back into the identity I understood, the version of myself that made decisions and signed contracts and built enterprises that provided jobs and value and beauty, in the form of carefully curated books for communities that needed gathering places. The office building that housed my primary workspace was a converted warehouse in the growing River North district of Boulder, with exposed brick walls and high ceilings and enough natural light that I rarely needed to turn on the overhead fixtures. I had bought the building 5 years ago when the area was just beginning its transformation from industrial to creative commercial, and the investment had appreciated substantially, while also providing exactly the kind of workspace I wanted for myself and my growing staff. My assistant, Jordan Kim, was already at their desk when I arrived, and they looked up from their computer with an expression that combined relief and curiosity. Jordan was 27, brilliant with organizational systems, and completely unimpressed by wealth or status, which made them perfect for managing my schedule and filtering the constant stream of requests for my time and attention. "Welcome back," Jordan said, standing to hand me a stack of messages and mail that had accumulated during my absence. "I assume yesterday went well based on the fact that you are here and not in jail for contempt of court." "It went better than well," I replied, unlocking my office door and gesturing for Jordan to follow me inside. "It went almost surreally well in ways I am still processing." Derek's attorney apparently did not review our financial disclosures before filing for the hearing, and they walked into court demanding spousal support without realizing I was worth $42 million. Jordan's eyebrows rose toward their hairline. "That is spectacularly incompetent. Like potentially disbarment level incompetent. Judge Hendricks threatened sanctions. I would feel bad for Richard Gould except that his incompetence worked entirely in my favor and saved me months of litigation." "So it is over? The divorce is final?" "As of yesterday afternoon. Derek has 30 days to move his belongings out of the house, and then I never have to interact with him again unless we accidentally end up at the same social event, which seems unlikely given that we operate in completely different circles." Jordan nodded slowly, processing this information. "How are you feeling about it?" The question stopped me because it was simple and direct, and expected an actual answer, rather than a performance of finesse. "Relieved," I said after a moment. And confused. And uncertain about things I thought I had figured out years ago. Is that a normal response to getting exactly what you wanted? I think it is a normal response to having your life change dramatically even when the change is positive, Jordan replied. You were married for 7 years. That is a significant portion of your adult life. Even if the marriage was not good, even if leaving it was absolutely the right choice, it still represents a major transition that is going to take time to integrate. I set down the stack of messages and walked to the window that overlooked the river, watching the water move past with the kind of certainty and purpose that I wished I felt in this moment. Derek sent me a bunch of texts last night, I said without turning around, trying to get me to agree to talk to him privately, to reconsider, to give him another chance. The final message accused me of hiding who I am and said I would end up alone because of it. That is manipulation and projection and a dozen other toxic behaviors, Jordan said immediately. You know that, right? You know that his inability to see you is not your fault and his accusations say far more about him than they do about you. I know that intellectually, but emotionally I keep circling back to the question of why I let him believe something about me that was so fundamentally wrong. Why I participated in the fiction instead of insisting on the truth. Jordan joined me at the window, standing beside me in companionable silence for a moment before speaking. Can I tell you something my therapist told me when I was processing my own divorce? She said that sometimes we make ourselves smaller not because we are ashamed of our size but because we are testing whether people will love us anyway. We want to know if the love is real or if it is just attracted to our success or our money or our power. So we hide those things to see what is left. The words landed with the weight of recognition, of someone articulating something I had felt but had never quite named. That is exactly what I was doing, I said quietly. I wanted to know if Derek would love me, even if I was just a minimum wage bookstore clerk. I wanted the love to be about me as a person rather than me as a financial asset. And what did you learn? That he did not love me even when he thought I was small. He loved the idea of being the provider and the successful one in the relationship. He loved feeling superior and necessary and like he was doing me a favor by being with me. The version of me he thought he was married to was not loved. It was tolerated and condescended to and dismissed. Jordan made a sound of agreement. So the experiment failed, but you learned something valuable. You learned that making yourself smaller does not actually test for genuine love. It just attracts people who are comfortable with or who actively prefer a diminished version of you. I turned away from the window to face Jordan directly. So what do I do now? How do I figure out how to be my full self in relationship when I have spent years practicing being partial? I think you start by being your full self with yourself, Jordan suggested. You have been successful in business because you bring your complete intelligence and creativity and drive to your work. But it sounds like you have been fragmented in your personal life, showing different pieces to different people, and never quite integrating all the parts into a whole. Maybe the work now is integration rather than revelation. Maybe you need to become fully yourself for yourself before you can be fully yourself with someone else. The insight settled into my chest with the uncomfortable recognition of truth that required action rather than simply acknowledgement. Jordan was right. The divorce had revealed not just Derek's failure to see me but my own failure to be fully visible. And healing that fracture would require work that was interior and difficult and completely different from the kind of building and achieving and succeeding I had spent my adult life perfecting. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret asking if I was available for a call to discuss some follow-up documentation that needed to be filed with the court. I excused myself from Jordan and took the call, spending 20 minutes discussing practical matters of decree filing and title transfers, and the administrative details that transformed a marriage into separate legal entities once again. When the call ended, I sat at my desk surrounded by the evidence of my success, the awards and photographs and architectural drawings for future locations, and I felt the strange disconnect between the external achievements and the internal uncertainty. I had built something remarkable in my professional life, but I had failed to build anything comparable in terms of personal integration and authentic relationship. The divorce had forced me to confront that failure, and now I had to decide what I was going to do with the confrontation. The rest of the day proceeded with meetings and decisions and the comfortable rhythm of work that I understood and could navigate with competence and confidence. I reviewed expansion proposals and met with architects and discussed marketing strategies with my director of communications. Each meeting pulled me further into the identity that felt solid and established, the version of myself that knew exactly what she was doing and why. But underneath the professional competence, underneath the confident decision-making and strategic planning, the questions remained. Who was I when I was not performing competence? Who was Nina when she was not running businesses or negotiating contracts or building empires? What parts of myself had I sacrificed or hidden or simply never developed because I had been so focused on external achievement that internal integration had seemed unnecessary or even counterproductive? Evening arrived with the kind of autumn twilight that made Colorado famous, the sky turning shades of amber and purple that seemed almost artificially beautiful. I drove home through streets I had lived near for over a decade, passing familiar landmarks and businesses and the houses where neighbors I barely knew despite years of proximity lived their own complex lives. My house appeared at the end of the winding driveway, lit from within by the smart lighting system I had programmed to make it look inhabited even when I was working late. I walked through rooms that were finally entirely mine, decorated with my preferences and filled with my belongings, and instead of feeling the liberation I had expected, I felt a strange loneliness that had nothing to do with Derek's absence and everything to do with the recognition that I had been alone even when I was married, even when another person lived in these rooms and slept in this bed and existed in this space. The loneliness had been there all along, hidden beneath the busyness and the work and the careful maintenance of separate identities, and now that Derek was gone and the divorce was final and I no longer had to perform any version of myself for someone who was not paying attention anyway, the loneliness had room to be felt fully. I poured a glass of wine from a bottle I had been saving, one of the expensive vintages Derek had never appreciated because he could not taste the difference between a $40 bottle and a $400 bottle and saw no point in the expense. I took the wine to my study, the room where I did my evening work and where bookshelves held my personal collection of first editions and signed copies, and I sat in the comfortable chair by the window and allowed myself to simply feel whatever was present without trying to fix it or solve it or make it into something productive. The recognition that had been building all day finally crystallized into something clear and undeniable. I had been successful at building businesses and generating wealth and creating external security. I had failed at building intimate relationships and generating authentic connection, and creating internal security that was not dependent on achievement and productivity. The divorce had removed the distraction of a failing marriage, and had forced me to confront the question I had been avoiding through busyness and strategic self-concealment. If I was not building something or achieving something or succeeding at something, who was I? And was that person enough to be loved not for what she had accomplished but for who she actually was underneath all the accomplishments? The questions did not have immediate answers, but sitting with them in the growing darkness of my study with expensive wine I could now drink without apology or explanation, I understood that finding the answers would be the real work of this next chapter. The divorce was over, but the discovery of who I was when I was not protecting myself from being seen was just beginning. The morning after my conversation with Claire brought an unexpected phone call from my mother, Patricia Castellano, calling from her home in Santa Fe where she had moved 5 years ago after my father died. My mother had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when something significant had happened in my life, appearing with advice or support or simply presence at exactly the moments when I needed her most, even when I had not realized I needed anything at all. "Your sister told me about the hearing," she said without preamble when I answered, her voice carrying the distinctive blend of warmth and directness that had characterized her parenting style throughout my childhood. "I wanted to give you space to process before calling, but I have been sitting here drinking my coffee and thinking about you, and I decided that maternal instinct trumps polite distance." I smiled despite the emotional exhaustion that still lingered from the previous day's introspection. My mother had never been one to wait for invitation when she believed her children needed her, and there was something comforting about that consistency even now when I was 35 years old and supposedly capable of managing my own emotional landscape. "The hearing went well," I told her, moving to the kitchen to start my own coffee while we talked. "Better than well, actually. Derek's attorney did not review our financial disclosures before filing, and they walked into court with demands that collapsed the moment Judge Hendricks read my net worth aloud. $42 million, my mother said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Claire told me that part. She also told me about Derek's face when he realized what he had just walked away from. I wish I could say I felt sympathy for him, but I would be lying. And I promised myself years ago that I would not lie to my children even when honesty is uncomfortable. You never liked him, I observed, pouring water into the coffee maker and watching it begin its familiar brewing cycle. I tried to like him for your sake. But no, I never genuinely liked him. He reminded me too much of your father's business partner, the one who smiled constantly and complimented everyone, and underneath all that charm was just calculating how he could benefit from every relationship he cultivated. She paused, and I heard her setting down her coffee cup with a soft clink against a saucer. Derek was always performing, even in private family moments. That should have been a warning sign. The observation settled into the growing collection of insights about my marriage that I had been accumulating over the past 48 hours. My mother was right. Derek had always been performing, had always been aware of how he appeared to others, had always been managing his image rather than simply existing authentically. I had interpreted that quality as social grace or professional polish when actually it was evidence of someone who had no stable core beneath the performance. Claire said you are struggling with some questions about why you never told Derek about your actual financial situation, my mother continued. About why you let him believe you were earning minimum wage when you were actually building an empire. Do you want to talk about that? I hesitated, surprised by my own reluctance to discuss this with my mother when I had been willing to explore it with Claire just the night before. I think I was testing whether he would love me even if I had nothing to offer beyond myself, I finally said. I wanted to know if the relationship was about me as a person rather than me as a financial asset. And what did you learn? That he did not love me even when he thought I had nothing. He loved feeling superior to me. He loved believing he was the provider, and I was the dependent. The experiment failed, but I suppose I learned something from the failure. My mother was quiet for a long moment, and I could picture her sitting at her kitchen table in the adobe house she had bought with the life insurance money from my father's death, looking out at the New Mexico landscape she had fallen in love with during a vacation and had decided to make her permanent home. Nina, I am going to tell you something that your father said to me 3 months before he died, when he knew the cancer was winning and we were having the kinds of conversations people have when time is running out. I stopped moving, my hand frozen halfway to the coffee maker, suddenly aware that whatever she was about to say carried weight that required my full attention. He said that his biggest regret about our marriage was not that he had failed to make more money or achieve greater professional success, but that he had failed to make me feel seen for who I actually was rather than for who he needed me to be. He said he had spent 30 years married to a woman he had never fully known because he had been too focused on his own needs and assumptions to pay attention to mine. Her voice wavered slightly, emotion breaking through the usual control. He said that if he could give you and Claire one piece of advice about relationships, it would be to never settle for someone who does not actively work to see you completely, because being invisible in your own marriage is a loneliness that no amount of companionship can cure. Tears burned behind my eyes, unexpected and sudden, grief for my father mixing with recognition of the truth in his words. My parents' marriage had always seemed solid from the outside, a partnership that had lasted 3 decades and had produced 2 daughters who felt loved and supported. But my mother was revealing a hidden dimension to that relationship, a private loneliness that she had carried while maintaining the appearance of contentment. Did you feel invisible with Dad? I asked quietly. Sometimes. Not always, and not in the cruel way you experienced with Derek. Your father was a good man who loved me genuinely, but he loved the version of me he had constructed in his own mind more than he loved the actual woman I was becoming over the years. He saw the wife and mother but not always the person underneath those roles. It took his illness and the clarity that comes with mortality for him to recognize what he had missed. I am sorry, Mom. I did not know. You were not supposed to know. That was private between your father and me, and we worked through it as much as we could in the time he had left. I am telling you now because I see you making the same mistake I made, asking the wrong question about your marriage. You are asking why you hid your success from Derek, but the better question is why you chose someone who was so incurious about your actual life that you could hide something that significant for 7 years. The reframing shifted something in my understanding, moving the focus from my choices to Derek's failures in a way that felt simultaneously liberating and uncomfortable. You think I chose him because he would not look too closely? I think you chose him because you were afraid of being chosen for your money rather than for yourself, and Derek seemed safe because he appeared confident and self-sufficient. But confidence without curiosity is not actually safety. It is just another form of invisibility where you hide in plain sight because the other person cannot be bothered to look. I carried my coffee to the living room and settled into the chair by the window where I had sat the night before, watching the morning light transform the familiar landscape of my property into something that looked almost new. So what do I do now? How do I avoid making the same mistake again? You start by grieving what you lost, which is not Derek but the years you spent trying to be loved by someone who was not capable of seeing you clearly enough to love what was actually there. You grieve the time and energy and emotional investment you put into a relationship that was never going to work because it was built on fundamentally incompatible approaches to intimacy. She paused, and I heard her taking a sip of her coffee before continuing. And then you do the harder work of figuring out why being seen felt so dangerous that you chose someone who would not look. That is going to require therapy, is it not? I said, attempting lightness but hearing the truth underneath the joke. Probably. Good therapy with someone who understands attachment and intimacy, and how successful women often sabotage their personal relationships because they have not learned how to integrate their professional competence with emotional vulnerability. My mother's voice was gentle but firm. You have built something remarkable in your business life, Nina. You have created value and beauty and community through your bookstores. But you have been treating your personal life like it is something separate, something that requires you to be a different person with different skills. The integration work is learning that the same qualities that made you successful professionally can also make you successful personally if you are willing to bring your whole self to relationships rather than fragmenting yourself into versions you think are more acceptable. We talked for another 20 minutes, shifting gradually from heavy emotional processing to lighter topics about her pottery classes and the garden she was planning for spring. But the core of her message remained with me after we hung up, settling into my thoughts like sediment that would eventually become solid ground. I needed to grieve and I needed to integrate and I needed to understand why visibility had felt so dangerous that I had chosen invisibility as a survival strategy. The afternoon brought a different kind of support in the form of my best friend from college, Rashida Okonkwo, who showed up at my office unannounced with lunch from the Mediterranean restaurant we had been going to since our university days. Rashida was a civil rights attorney who worked for a nonprofit legal organization, spending her days fighting housing discrimination and police misconduct, and all the ways that systems failed the people they were supposed to serve. She was also one of the few people in my life who had known me before I became successful, who remembered the version of Nina who had been uncertain and ambitious and still figuring out who she wanted to become. I heard through the legal gossip network about your courtroom triumph, Rashida said, spreading containers of hummus and tabbouleh and falafel across my office conference table. Margaret Chen's paralegal apparently cannot stop talking about the look on your husband's face when the judge read your net worth. It has become legendary in family law circles in the 48 hours since it happened. Ex-husband, I corrected, grateful for the food I had not realized I was hungry for. The divorce is final. Derek has 30 days to collect his belongings and then he ceases to be my problem. How are you feeling about it? Rashida asked, settling into a chair and fixing me with the direct gaze that made her effective in depositions and intimidating to opposing counsel. She had a gift for seeing through performances to the truth underneath, and I had learned years ago that attempting to hide my actual feelings from her was both pointless and disrespectful to our friendship. Relieved that it is over. Confused about why I stayed as long as I did. Questioning choices I made years ago about how much of myself to reveal and to whom. Wondering if I have been sabotaging my personal relationships because I am afraid of being chosen for my money rather than for who I actually am. I took a bite of falafel, letting the familiar flavors ground me in the present moment. So basically I am feeling everything all at once and trying to sort through it without falling apart. Rashida nodded slowly, chewing thoughtfully before responding. Do you remember sophomore year when you had that economics professor who kept hitting on you and making comments about how a pretty girl like you did not need to worry about understanding complex theories because you would just marry someone successful? And you stopped raising your hand in class and started deliberately performing less competently than you actually were so he would leave you alone? The memory surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. Professor Davidson, who had taught intermediate microeconomics and had seemed to take particular pleasure in undermining female students while praising male students for making the same points. I had spent the first month of that semester participating actively and earning top marks, And then I had spent the remaining 3 months making myself smaller to avoid his attention. I had forgotten about that, I admitted. Or maybe I had buried it because remembering felt too painful. I watched you learn that being visible as a competent, intelligent woman attracted the wrong kind of attention from men in positions of power. You learned that lesson and you internalized it, and then you spent the next 15 years applying that lesson to your relationships even when the circumstances were completely different. Rashida leaned forward, her expression intense. Derek was not Professor Davidson. He was not in a position of power over you. He was not threatening you or harassing you. But you still performed the same strategy of making yourself smaller and less visible, hiding your competence and success because somewhere deep in your unconscious mind you believed that visibility was dangerous. The analysis was uncomfortably accurate, connecting dots I had not realized formed a pattern. So I have been living out a trauma response from a bad experience in college for my entire adult life? I would not call it trauma exactly, but yes, you learned a strategy that worked in one specific context and then overgeneralized that strategy to contexts where it was not appropriate or necessary. That happens to a lot of successful women. We learn early that certain forms of visibility attract negative consequences, and we develop elaborate strategies to manage how we are seen. The problem is that those strategies often prevent genuine connection because we are always managing perception rather than simply existing authentically. I set down my food, appetite suddenly gone despite the hunger I had felt moments before. How do I unlearn 15 years of conditioning? How do I stop performing smallness and start existing at my actual size? Therapy is probably going to be essential, like your mom suggested. But I think the first step is just noticing when you are doing it. Noticing when you are minimizing your accomplishments or downplaying your success or hiding your intelligence because some part of you believes that visibility is dangerous. Once you notice the pattern, you can start making different choices consciously rather than just running the same program automatically. We finished lunch while discussing her current caseload and the frustrations of fighting systemic injustice through a legal system that was often designed to perpetuate the very injustices she was trying to remedy. Rashida had a gift for maintaining hope and commitment even when the work was discouraging, and I found her resilience inspiring even as I recognized that our professional challenges were vastly different in scope and stakes. As she was leaving, Rashida turned back at my office door and fixed me with another of her penetrating looks. "Nina, I want you to know something. You are one of the most genuinely good people I know. You built your businesses with integrity, you treat your employees well, you contribute to your community, you show up for the people you care about. The fact that Derek could not see that or appreciate it says everything about his limitations and nothing about your worth. Do not let his failure to value you make you question whether you are valuable. You are. The right person will see that without you having to hide or minimize or perform anything." After Rashida left, I sat in my office feeling the accumulation of support from the women in my life who were helping me make sense of the divorce and the questions it had raised. Claire with her insight about testing for genuine love. My mother with her wisdom about choosing curiosity over confidence. Rashida with her analysis of learned patterns and protective strategies. Each conversation had added another layer of understanding, another piece of the puzzle that was slowly revealing why I had made the choices I had made, and what those choices had cost me. My phone rang with a call from Emma Hoffman, my director of operations for the bookstore chain, and someone who had been with me since the early days when we were just 3 locations and everyone wore multiple hats because we did not have enough staff to specialize. Emma was 38, fiercely competent, and had built the operational systems that allowed my business to scale from a handful of stores to 12 locations across 3 states, without losing the distinctive character that made each store feel local and personal rather than corporate and generic. "I heard about the divorce being finalized," Emma said when I answered. "I wanted to check in and see how you are holding up and also to let you know that the staff at all locations has been speculating wildly about your personal life, and I have been shutting down gossip as efficiently as possible, while also acknowledging that people are naturally curious when the person who employs them goes through a major life change." "What are they speculating about?" I asked, curious despite myself about how my employees were processing the news of my divorce. "Mostly they are wondering how we never knew you were married. You never wore a wedding ring to work, you never mentioned a husband in staff meetings or casual conversations, and apparently nobody realized there was a significant relationship in your life at all until the announcement 3 months ago that you were separating." Emma paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. A few people are also wondering how you manage to keep your personal wealth so private, when most business owners at your level are fairly visible about their success. The observation highlighted another dimension of the invisibility I had been practicing for years. Not only had I hidden my success from Derek, but I had also hidden significant aspects of my personal life from my employees, maintaining such strict boundaries between my professional and personal identities that people who worked closely with me had not even known I was married. I suppose I have been very private about my personal life, I admitted, probably to an extreme that seemed strange to people who were paying attention. It did not seem strange exactly, just very intentional. You were always professional and friendly but never quite personal, if that makes sense. We knew you cared about the business and about us as employees, but we did not really know you as a person beyond the work context. Emma's voice was careful, clearly trying to give me honest feedback without seeming critical. Some of the staff have been saying that maybe now that the divorce is final, you might be more present or more open about who you are outside of work. The suggestion that my employees wanted to know me better as a person rather than just as their employer was touching and slightly uncomfortable simultaneously. I will think about that, I told Emma. I appreciate the feedback, even though hearing it makes me recognize how much I have been compartmentalizing different aspects of my life. For what it is worth, I think you have been an excellent employer, and your privacy about your personal life has not negatively impacted your leadership or the business. But I also think that people respond well to authenticity, and if you feel comfortable being more integrated in how you show up, that could deepen the already strong culture we have built. After the call ended, I added Emma's observation to the growing list of insights about how my protective strategies had extended far beyond my marriage to encompass virtually every relationship in my life. I had created such rigid boundaries between different aspects of my identity that even people who worked closely with me for years had not known basic facts about my life. That level of compartmentalization had protected me from certain vulnerabilities, but it had also prevented the kind of authentic connection that gave life depth and meaning beyond professional achievement. The evening brought one more conversation that contributed to my emerging understanding of the support network I had built without quite realizing I had built it. Michael Torres, my business manager, called to discuss some financial projections for the next quarter, but the conversation quickly moved beyond spreadsheets and revenue forecasts to more personal territory. I have been thinking about something since we talked yesterday, Michael said, his voice thoughtful in the way it got when he was working through complex ideas. You built this business empire while keeping your success hidden from your husband, which suggests a level of strategic compartmentalization that goes beyond normal privacy. That same quality probably contributed to your business success because you were never distracted by ego or the need for external validation. You just focused on building something excellent without worrying about getting credit or recognition. That sounds like you are suggesting my dysfunctional personal life was actually functional for my professional life, I observed. Not dysfunctional exactly, but yes, there is probably a relationship between your ability to operate without needing constant validation and your success in building businesses that focused on genuine value rather than appearance. You were never trying to impress anyone or prove anything. You were just building bookstores that served communities well. Michael paused, clearly choosing his next words carefully. But I wonder if the same quality that served you professionally has been limiting you personally. Maybe you need to learn how to want recognition and validation in your personal relationships, even though you have not needed them in your professional life. The analysis resonated with observations that Rashida and my mother had already made from different angles. I had learned to operate independently, to derive satisfaction from the work itself rather than from external approval, to measure success through internal standards rather than social recognition. Those qualities had made me an effective entrepreneur who could persevere through challenges without becoming discouraged by criticism or temporary setbacks. But they had also made me someone who did not ask for what I needed in relationships, who did not expect to be seen or known or celebrated, who had accepted Derek's inattention because I had not learned to require attention as a basic component of intimate partnership. So I need to learn to need people, I said, hearing the resistance in my own voice even as I recognized the truth of the observation. I need to learn to ask for recognition and validation, instead of pretending I can function indefinitely without them. You need to learn that needing people is not weakness, and that allowing yourself to be known is not the same as being vulnerable to exploitation. Those are different things, but I think somewhere along the way you conflated them. Michael's voice was gentle but firm. You are allowed to be successful and wealthy and competent and still need emotional support and recognition, and someone who actually knows who you are and celebrates that person rather than tolerating a diminished version. After we finished discussing the financial projections that had been the nominal reason for the call, I sat in my home office looking at the view of Boulder spread out below my hillside property, and feeling the weight of all the conversations that had occurred over the past 2 days. My support network had surrounded me with insight and perspective and gentle challenges to examine my own patterns, and I felt simultaneously grateful for their care and overwhelmed by the magnitude of the work they were collectively suggesting I needed to do. The integration they were describing, the unlearning of protective strategies that had become limiting rather than liberating, the development of capacity to need people and to allow myself to be known completely rather than strategically, all of that represented a fundamental transformation of how I related to myself and to others. It was work that would require sustained effort and uncomfortable vulnerability, and the willingness to risk the very visibility I had spent years learning to avoid. But sitting there in the growing darkness with the lights of the city below me, and the weight of recent understanding settling into something approaching clarity, I understood that this work was not optional if I wanted my life to feel integrated and authentic, rather than fragmented and performative. The divorce had removed the immediate distraction of a failing marriage, and now I had to decide whether I was willing to do the deeper work of becoming someone who could succeed at intimate relationships with the same competence and commitment I had brought to professional achievement. The question was no longer why I had hidden my success from Derek or why I had chosen someone so incurious about my actual life. The question now was whether I was willing to become visible, to integrate the different aspects of my identity into a coherent whole, to risk being seen completely and to learn how to need the kind of recognition and validation that I had spent my adult life pretending I could function without. The answer I was beginning to understand had to be yes. Not because the work would be easy or comfortable or quickly accomplished, but because the alternative was continuing to live a fragmented existence where professional success coexisted with personal isolation, where achievement masked the loneliness of being perpetually unseen. The support network I had built without quite realizing it had shown me what was possible when I allowed people to know me, and their collective wisdom was pointing toward a version of myself that was integrated rather than compartmentalized, visible rather than strategically hidden, capable of both success and genuine intimacy rather than forced to choose between them. The journey from where I was to where I needed to be would require sustained effort, and probably professional therapeutic support, and certainly uncomfortable moments of vulnerability with people who mattered to me. But for the first time since the courtroom revelation 2 days ago, I felt something beyond confusion and questioning. I felt something that might have been readiness, or at least willingness, to begin the work of becoming fully myself rather than continuing to perform the carefully managed versions that had kept me safe but had also kept me fundamentally alone. The work of understanding how I had arrived at this moment of divorce clarity required excavating the history that had shaped my patterns of protection and concealment. 3 days after the final hearing, I found myself sitting in the climate-controlled storage unit where I kept boxes of old journals, photographs, and documents from my early 20s, searching for evidence of the person I had been before I learned to make myself strategically invisible. The storage facility was one of those anonymous buildings on the outskirts of Boulder, all concrete and fluorescent lighting and numbered units that could contain anything from family heirlooms to forgotten furniture. I had rented this particular space 7 years ago when Derek and I moved in together, boxing up aspects of my life that did not fit the narrative of who I was supposed to be as his wife. At the time, I had told myself I was simply making room in our shared home, creating space for our combined belongings. Now, sitting among these archived pieces of my past, I recognized the storage unit for what it actually was. A repository for the parts of myself I had decided were too complicated or too revealing to integrate into my marriage. The first box I opened contained journals from my undergraduate years at the University of Colorado, spiral-bound notebooks filled with my younger self's handwriting, slightly rounder and less controlled than my current script. I flipped through pages randomly, catching fragments of the person I had been at 19 and 20 and 21, before business success and strategic self-presentation had taught me to carefully manage what I revealed. One entry from October of my sophomore year stopped me completely. The date was 2 weeks after the incident with Professor Davidson that Rashida had reminded me about, And the words on the page carried a rawness that made my chest tighten with recognition of pain I had apparently buried rather than processed. I raised my hand in econ today to answer a question about price elasticity, and Professor Davidson called on me, but then immediately dismissed my answer without even listening to it completely. He said something about how I should focus more on understanding the basics before trying to tackle complex applications, even though my answer was correct and addressed exactly what he had asked. 3 guys in the class gave essentially the same answer after me, and he praised all of them for their sophisticated thinking. I felt my face get hot and I wanted to argue, but I just sat there silent because what is the point of being right if speaking up just makes you a target for humiliation? I sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, holding that journal and feeling the weight of what my 19-year-old self had learned in that classroom. Speaking up made you visible, and visibility made you vulnerable to dismissal and humiliation from people with power. The lesson had been reinforced throughout that semester as I watched Professor Davidson systematically undermine female students while elevating male students, regardless of the actual quality of their contributions. By the end of the course, I had stopped participating entirely, had deliberately performed at a level just competent enough to pass without attracting attention, had learned that safety lay in strategic invisibility. The next journal I pulled from the box was from my junior year, and the entries documented my first attempts at entrepreneurship through an online business selling vintage books I found at estate sales and thrift stores. The excitement in those pages was palpable, my younger self documenting every small success with the kind of enthusiasm that came from discovering something I was genuinely good at, and that generated actual income beyond my part-time campus job. But interspersed with the excitement were entries about the reactions I received when I told people about my business. Male classmates who dismissed it as a hobby rather than a real enterprise. A boyfriend who suggested I was getting distracted from my studies and should focus more on my coursework and our relationship. A career counselor who told me that while entrepreneurship was admirable, I should consider more stable career paths that would provide security and benefits. Each dismissal had apparently reinforced the lesson I had learned from Professor Davidson. Visibility attracted judgment, and success that made others uncomfortable was better kept private. One entry from April of my senior year detailed a conversation with that same boyfriend, Marcus Chan, who I had dated for 18 months before the relationship dissolved in mutual frustration about priorities and future plans. Marcus told me today that he is worried about our future together, because I am too focused on my book business and not focused enough on us. He said that relationships require sacrifice and compromise, and right now it feels like I am choosing my business over our partnership. I tried to explain that the business is part of who I am, not something separate from our relationship, but he just kept saying that if I really loved him I would make him the priority. We ended up fighting and I left feeling like there is something wrong with me for wanting both a relationship and a business that I am building from nothing. Why does it have to be a choice? Why cannot both things matter simultaneously? Reading those words 2 decades later, I could see the pattern emerging even then. Marcus had not been malicious or deliberately manipulative, but he had operated from an assumption that my success and ambition were in competition with our relationship rather than being integral parts of who I was. He had wanted me to choose between visibility in my professional life and visibility in our personal partnership, never understanding that fragmenting myself that way meant neither realm got the full version of who I actually was. I set aside the journals and moved to a box of photographs from those same years. Pictures of me at 22 standing in front of my first bookstore location, the day I signed the lease and officially became a business owner. My grandmother Rosa had come with me for that signing, had been the only family member who seemed to understand the significance of what I was attempting to build. In the photograph, Grandmother Rosa stood beside me with her hand on my shoulder, both of us smiling with the kind of joy that comes from recognizing a moment that will be remembered as a turning point. Grandmother Rosa had died 6 months after that photograph was taken, suddenly and without the kind of warning that allows for final conversations and proper goodbyes. She left me the inheritance that I used to actually purchase the bookstore rather than just leasing the space, and she left me a letter that I had read so many times in the years since her death that I had memorized every word. I found that letter now in a small wooden box that also contained her wedding ring and a locket with photographs of her own parents, immigrants from Italy who had arrived in New York with nothing, and had built a life through relentless work and strategic sacrifice. The letter was written in Grandmother Rosa's elegant cursive, The handwriting of someone who had been educated in an era when penmanship was considered a reflection of character. I unfolded the pages carefully, the paper thin and slightly fragile from years of handling, and I read her words again even though I could have recited them from memory. My dearest Nina, if you are reading this letter, then I am gone, and you are standing at the threshold of something significant. I have watched you build your little book business with the same determination and intelligence that I saw in myself at your age, and I recognize in you the qualities that allowed me to survive and eventually thrive in a world that was not designed to accommodate women who refused to be small. I am leaving you money not because I think you need it to succeed, but because I want you to have options and security, and the freedom to take risks without gambling your survival on every decision. Use it wisely, but use it boldly. Do not let anyone convince you that success makes you less feminine, or that ambition makes you less worthy of love. The right person will celebrate your strength rather than being threatened by it. Until you find that person, be complete in yourself. Build your empire. Create beauty and value. Do not apologize for taking up space in the world. I love you with my entire heart, and I am proud of who you are becoming. Your grandmother, Rosa. Sitting in the storage unit with that letter in my hands, I felt grief for my grandmother mixing with recognition of how thoroughly I had failed to follow her advice. She had told me not to let anyone convince me that success made me less worthy of love, and yet I had spent 7 years married to someone who required me to minimize my success in order to feel comfortable in our partnership. She had told me to be complete in myself rather than fragmenting into versions I thought would be more acceptable, and yet I had compartmentalized every aspect of my identity to the point where even people who worked closely with me did not know basic facts about my life. I had inherited her money and her business acumen and her capacity for strategic thinking, but I had failed to inherit her refusal to be made small by others' discomfort with her size. Somewhere between her death and my marriage to Derek, I had learned exactly the opposite lesson from what she had tried to teach me. I had learned that being small was safer than being fully visible, that hiding my success protected me from judgment and resentment, that strategic invisibility was a form of self-preservation rather than self-diminishment. The next box contained financial records from the early years of my business expansion, the spreadsheets and loan documents and contracts that documented how I had grown from 1 location to 3, then to 6, then to the current 12. Looking through these documents now, I was struck by how competent and confident my 25-year-old self had been in business negotiations, how I had advocated for favorable terms and pushed back against offers that undervalued my company, how I had walked away from deals that did not serve my long-term vision even when short-term pressure made acceptance tempting. That version of Nina had known her worth in professional contexts, and had insisted that others recognize it as well. She had negotiated from a position of strength even when she was actually operating with limited capital and significant risk. She had performed confidence and competence until those qualities became genuinely integrated rather than merely performed. But apparently she had never learned to bring those same qualities to her personal relationships, never learned to negotiate for what she needed emotionally with the same clarity and firmness she brought to business contracts. I found a folder containing correspondence from that period, including several letters I had written but apparently never sent. One was addressed to Marcus, my college boyfriend, and was dated 3 months after our breakup. The letter attempted to explain why I had chosen my business over our relationship, why I could not be the person he wanted me to be, why his requirement that I choose between my ambition and our partnership had felt like being asked to choose between breathing and having a heartbeat. You wanted me to be softer and more available, and less consumed by work that you saw as competition for my attention. But my work is not separate from who I am. Building this business is how I understand myself and my capabilities and my place in the world. Asking me to diminish that part of myself so you could feel more important in my life was like asking me to cut off a limb to prove my love. I could not do it. I tried to explain this while we were together, but you could not hear me because you fundamentally believe that relationships require sacrifice of individual identity, rather than integration of 2 whole people who choose to build something together while remaining complete in themselves. I hope you find someone who is willing to make the sacrifices you require. I am not that person, and I am learning to believe that is acceptable rather than evidence of failure. The letter revealed a clarity about what I needed from intimate relationships that I had apparently possessed at 23, but had somehow lost or abandoned by the time I met Derek at 28. What had happened in those 5 years to shift my understanding from insisting on integration to accepting fragmentation? When had I stopped believing I deserved a partner who would celebrate my wholeness rather than requiring my diminishment? I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through my calendar to find the exact date. I had met Derek at that business conference in Denver. September 15th, 7 years ago. The conference had been focused on small business growth strategies, and I had been there to learn about scaling operations while maintaining quality and distinctive character. Derek had been attending because his employer at the time, Horizon Technologies, was sponsoring the event, and he was working the company booth during breaks between sessions. I remembered the conversation we had struck up over coffee during an afternoon break, how Derek had seemed genuinely interested in my bookstore business, asking questions about my expansion plans and commenting on how impressive it was that I had built something sustainable in an industry that was supposedly dying. He had seemed different from other men I had dated, more secure in himself, less threatened by my success, genuinely supportive of what I was building. But now, reviewing that first encounter through the lens of everything I had learned about Derek over 7 years of marriage, I recognized that his interest had been performance rather than genuine curiosity. He had asked questions but had not listened carefully to the answers. He had complimented my achievements but in ways that subtly diminished their significance. He had positioned himself as someone who appreciated successful women, while simultaneously communicating through countless small signals that he expected to be the more successful partner in any relationship he entered. I had missed or ignored those signals because by that point in my life I had learned to expect some level of discomfort from men regarding my success. Derek's subtle undermining had seemed preferable to the more obvious insecurity I had experienced with other partners. I had mistaken his polished dismissiveness for comfort with my achievements, had confused his lack of direct opposition with actual support, had accepted a relationship where I was tolerated, rather than celebrated, because tolerance felt like an improvement over active resentment. The storage unit had grown cold as afternoon shifted toward evening, the temperature dropping in the unheated concrete space. I gathered the journals and letters and photographs back into their boxes, not ready to take them home but needing to mark this archaeological expedition as complete for now. I had found what I came looking for: evidence of how the patterns had formed, documentation of the moments when I had learned lessons that had shaped my approach to relationships for 2 decades. The drive home took me past the original bookstore location, and I pulled into the parking lot on impulse, getting out of my car to stand in front of the building I had purchased at 23 with my grandmother's inheritance and my own borrowed courage. The store had changed over the years, with updated signage and renovated interiors and expanded inventory, but the essential character remained the same. It was still a place where books were celebrated and readers were welcomed and community was built through the simple act of people gathering around stories that mattered. I had built this in 11 other locations like it through competence and vision and sustained effort over more than a decade. I had created something that generated millions in revenue while also providing value that could not be measured in financial terms alone. I had employed hundreds of people and served tens of thousands of customers, and contributed to the cultural life of communities across 3 states. That was not nothing. That was not a hobby or a cute little business or something to be dismissed or minimized or hidden to make insecure partners feel more comfortable. Standing there in the October twilight with the bookstore glowing warm behind its display windows, I felt something shift in my understanding. The problem had never been that I was too successful or too ambitious or too focused on work. The problem had been that I kept choosing partners who required me to pretend otherwise, who needed me to be smaller than I actually was, who could only feel secure in relationships where they held the economic and professional power regardless of the actual circumstances. Derek had been the most extreme version of that pattern, but he had not been the first. Marcus before him, and several other boyfriends before Marcus, had all operated from similar assumptions that my success was somehow in competition with our relationship, that my visibility in professional contexts required invisibility in personal ones, that loving me meant accepting a diminished version rather than celebrating the whole person. I had participated in that diminishment, had made myself strategically invisible, had hidden my success because I believed that made me more lovable or more acceptable or more likely to find someone who would choose me. But Grandmother Rosa's letter had been right. The right person would celebrate my strength rather than being threatened by it. The right person would not require me to choose between professional success and personal intimacy. The right person would understand that I was complete in myself, and that partnership meant 2 whole people building something together, rather than one person sacrificing wholeness to accommodate the other's insecurity. I had not found that person yet because I had not been looking for them. I had been looking for someone who would tolerate my success if I hid it carefully enough, someone who would love me despite my achievements rather than because of the full person those achievements revealed me to be. That had been the wrong search based on the wrong question, leading inevitably to the wrong outcomes. My phone rang with a call from my therapist's office, the administrative assistant confirming an appointment I had scheduled earlier in the week with Dr. Sarah Brennan, a psychologist who specialized in high-achieving women navigating personal relationships. The appointment was set for tomorrow afternoon, and I confirmed I would be there, recognizing that the work of excavating patterns was only the first step. Understanding how I had arrived at this point did not automatically create the map for moving forward. That would require guidance from someone trained to help people untangle the complicated relationships between success and intimacy, between visibility and vulnerability, between the person I had become professionally and the person I needed to learn to be in personal relationships. That evening I sat in my study with a folder of old letters and a fresh journal I had purchased specifically for this process of integration and understanding. I wrote about what I had discovered in the storage unit, about the patterns that had formed starting in my undergraduate years, about the ways I had learned to protect myself through strategic invisibility, and how that protection had eventually become a cage that prevented genuine connection. I wrote about Grandmother Rosa's letter and the failure to follow her advice, about choosing Derek and the series of small compromises that had led to 7 years of being unseen in my own marriage. I wrote about the question that had been forming over the past several days of reflection and conversation, the question that felt both terrifying and necessary to answer. Who would I become if I stopped protecting myself through invisibility? What would my life look like if I brought the same competence and confidence to personal relationships that I have brought to professional achievement? What kind of partner would I choose if I was looking for celebration rather than toleration? If I refused to hide any aspect of who I am? If I insisted on being loved for my wholeness rather than for a carefully managed version designed to make someone else comfortable? The questions sat on the page without immediate answers, but asking them felt like progress nonetheless. The excavation of history had revealed the origins of patterns that no longer served me, and now the work was to decide consciously and deliberately what patterns I wanted to cultivate going forward. That work would require time and therapeutic support, and probably uncomfortable moments of vulnerability, as I learned to exist at my full size in all contexts, rather than fragmenting myself into acceptable versions. But sitting in my study with my grandmother's letter beside me and evidence of my own journey spread across my desk, I felt something that might have been hope or at least readiness to begin the work of integration. The divorce had ended my marriage to Derek, but it had also initiated a more important process of divorcing myself from the protective strategies that had kept me safe, but had also kept me perpetually alone even when surrounded by people. The historical context explained how I had arrived here, but it did not determine where I went next. That was still to be decided, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had both the clarity and the courage to make different choices than the ones that had brought me to this moment of necessary transformation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.